It all started on a calm Saturday morning. I had barely poured myself a cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was my parents, letting me know they wanted to visit on Sunday, just to check in and spend some time with us. Being the straightforward man I am, I immediately agreed and told them it was a great idea. Family is important to me, and I figured a quiet Sunday at home with my parents sounded perfect. After hanging up, I told my wife about it. She didn't seem to mind, simply saying, "Okay, that's fine," and went back to whatever she was doing. For me, it was just another normal start to the weekend. Later that afternoon, something odd happened. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard her phone ring. The sound itself wasn't unusual, but her reaction was. She practically jumped out of her chair, as if the call were some emergency. Before I could even ask what was going on, she darted toward the kitchen with her phone in hand. That kind of urgency was enough to catch my attention, so I got up and followed her. When I got closer, I could hear her speaking in a hushed voice. She wasn't just being quiet, she was whispering so softly I could barely make out a word. I leaned on the doorframe and asked, "What's going on?" "Who's calling?" She gave me a quick glance, waved her hand dismissively, and mouthed, "Later." That didn't sit right with me. What could be so secretive that she had to whisper like that? I stood there for a moment, debating whether to press the issue, but decided to let it go. She'd explain herself eventually. Or at least, I hoped she would. For now, I returned to the living room, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something strange was unfolding. The conversation didn't end quickly, either. She stayed on the phone for nearly an hour. An entire hour of whispering. By the time she finally hung up, I was no longer just curious, I was irritated. What the hell was that about? I asked as soon as she reappeared. "Who on earth were you talking to for that long, and why were you whispering?" She looked at me with that casual, unbothered expression that drives me up the wall sometimes and said, "Oh, that was about tomorrow. We're going to have some guests." That set me off. "What do you mean, guests?" "My parents are coming over tomorrow." "Did you forget about that?" I could feel my temper rising, though I kept my tone steady. Her reply didn't help. "Yeah, I know. But these are secret guests," she said, as if that explained anything. "Secret guests?" I repeated, now genuinely annoyed. "You're kidding, right? Who are these people, and why are they coming here of all places? Did you even think to tell me before agreeing to this?" She sighed, as if I were the one being unreasonable, and said, "They're friends of mine." "Well, sort of. I met this woman online a couple of weeks ago on a forum about hobbies and fun stuff, and we really hit it off. She and her husband are coming to visit. They're unique. And they've got something big they want to share. Oh, and they're bringing us a special gift." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "So let me get this straight. Two complete strangers you met on the internet are coming to our house to sit with my parents, and you think this is a good idea?" My voice was calm, but the anger was bubbling beneath the surface. She nodded, unflinching. "It's not that big of a deal. I've already invited them, so it's happening. You'll see, it'll be fine." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She had already made the decision without consulting me, and now I was supposed to just go along with it? My jaw tightened as I fixed her with a hard stare. I didn't say another word. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there. In my head, all I could think was, who the hell are these people, and how is this supposed to work? I had a sinking feeling this wasn't going to end well. Sunday arrived, and with it came my parents. As expected, they were punctual, dressed in their usual conservative attire, bringing along a homemade pie and their usual warm but formal demeanor. My parents are the kind of people who value tradition and propriety above all else, and I've always respected that about them. As they settled into our living room, I could tell they were glad to be here, and I hoped it would be a peaceful afternoon. I kept glancing at my wife, silently praying that her secret guests would find some reason not to show up. Maybe they'd forget, or maybe the universe would intervene in some miraculous way to spare me the headache. The first hour passed smoothly enough. My mom complimented the curtains, my dad asked me about work, and my wife seemed content, even cheerful. It was a rare moment of calm. But, as if the universe had heard my earlier thoughts and decided to spite me, the doorbell rang. The sound shattered the peace like a rock through a window. My father glanced at me and asked, "Are you expecting someone else?" Before I could respond, my wife was already halfway to the door. "Oh, I forgot to mention," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, "you're not the only guests we'll have today." My father raised an eyebrow, the lines on his forehead deepening. He's a man of few words, but that look spoke volumes. My mother, ever the picture of composure, sat up straighter, clearly intrigued, but not yet alarmed. Meanwhile, I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. When I turned to see who was at the door, I nearly lost my composure. There they were, the secret guests my wife had been so eager to host. The woman wore pink tights, a miniskirt that looked like it belonged in a high school wardrobe, and a crop top that barely covered anything. Her husband wasn't much better, with his long hair, ripped jeans, and a t-shirt featuring some obscure rock band. They looked completely out of place, like characters from a bad sitcom. My wife greeted them with a sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. She looked thrilled, as if royalty had just arrived. Meanwhile, I turned to my mom and saw her pale visibly. My dad's expression shifted from curiosity to something closer to disbelief. Before I could even react, the guest stepped inside, carrying a large, brightly wrapped gift. They introduced themselves cheerfully, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. My wife ushered them into the living room, where they placed the gift on the coffee table and announced, "We brought something special for you all." The moment my wife began unwrapping the gift, I knew it was a mistake. Inside was a collection of items that I won't describe in detail, but let's just say they were anything but appropriate for a family gathering. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother looked like she might faint. I grabbed the box, muttered a terse thanks, and carried it out of the room before the situation could get any worse. I placed it in the hallway, far from everyone's view, and returned to find an awkward silence hanging in the air. We all sat down, and my father, ever the disciplinarian, tried to make polite conversation. But it was clear that things were already spiraling. The guests, oblivious to the tension, smiled and whispered to each other, completely at ease. Then came the moment that sealed the disaster. The man from the couple leaned forward and said, "Remember how we talked about making a big announcement?" My wife nodded eagerly. "Well," the man continued, "we've decided to open up our marriage, and we thought this would be the perfect time to share that with everyone." The room erupted. My father, who'd been holding his tongue all evening, could no longer contain himself. "That's not openness," he said sharply. "That's adultery. Plain and simple." The debate quickly escalated into a full-blown argument, with voices rising and tempers flaring. My mother, who hates confrontation, sat frozen, clutching the armrest like a lifeline. The guests tried to defend their lifestyle, but my father wasn't having any of it. At one point, he stood up and said, "If I were your age, I'd have knocked some sense into you by now. But I'm smarter than that, so we're leaving." I escorted my parents to the door, apologizing profusely as my father gave me a look I'll never forget. It was the kind of look that says, "You've really screwed up this time." No words were necessary. The shame hit me like a ton of bricks. After they left, I stood at the door for a moment, staring out into the night, wondering how this day had gone so disastrously wrong. Then, with a heavy sigh, I turned and walked back inside, bracing myself for whatever was to come next. My wife had brought the box back into the living room, and I couldn't believe my eyes as she started pulling out its contents and lining them up on the coffee table. It was bad enough that my parents had witnessed this circus the day before, but now she was treating it like a display at a trade show. I stood there for a moment, watching in disbelief, before turning to the couple who had just finished making themselves comfortable on our couch. "You couldn't have waited until another time, maybe told us privately. This whole thing was poorly timed as it is, and you've managed to make it worse by showing up on the same day as my parents." My tone was firm, leaving no room for ambiguity. Instead of taking the hint, my wife shot me a glare. "Stop ruining what's already ruined," she snapped. "You're not making things any better by harping on it." Her defiance was startling. Before I could respond, she grabbed my arm and dragged me into the kitchen. "We need to talk," I said through clenched teeth. She folded her arms and waited. "This can't go on. You've invited people into our home without consulting me, they caused a massive fight with my parents, and now you're defending them like this is all normal. This needs to stop." She rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. "You're overreacting. Things will settle down. Let's just get through the evening." I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I decided not to escalate things further. For the rest of the evening, I kept my distance, though my thoughts raced non-stop. What kind of mess had she dragged us into? I couldn't understand how she was so comfortable with everything that had happened. Later, as we sat in strained silence, I decided to address the practical matter of their stay. "When are you planning to leave?" I asked the couple directly. For once, they seemed caught off guard. The husband exchanged a look with his wife before responding, "Well, we were actually hoping to stay here for a while. You know, just until we get back on our feet." His casual tone made it sound as if this was a perfectly reasonable request. I stared at them, then at my wife, waiting for her to shut this idea down. To my shock, she said, "Of course you can stay. We have plenty of room." My stomach dropped. Was she serious? I managed to keep my composure but couldn't stop myself from thinking, this is unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. The couple wasted no time making themselves at home. They went to take a shower, together, of course, and I turned to my wife, finally letting my frustration show. "Do you even realize what you've done?" I asked, my voice low but intense. First, they completely disrupted things with my parents. Then, they decided they'd just stay here without even asking properly. And now you're letting them walk all over us. I have work tomorrow, and you'll be the one dealing with them. She shrugged dismissively. Your parents are too sensitive. It's not my fault they overreacted. And what's wrong with being hospitable? They needed a place to stay, and we have space. Her nonchalance was infuriating, but before I could argue further, she added, besides, tomorrow is going to be great. When you get home, you'll see. You'll love it. That night, we went to bed, leaving the couple to sleep on the couch in the living room. Also, I thought. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by noises coming from the other side of the house. At first, I tried to ignore it, hoping they'd quiet down. But it only got louder. I couldn't believe it when I realized what they were doing. Right there, in our living room. I lay there, fuming, unable to sleep, and knowing full well that tomorrow was going to be an even bigger disaster. In the morning, as I got ready for work, I turned to my wife and said, if this kind of thing happens again, I'm throwing them out. I don't care how it looks or what they say. They're out. She waved me off like it was nothing. Oh, stop being so dramatic. By tonight, you'll feel differently. Just wait and see. You'll come around. Her confidence only made me more uneasy, but I didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, I left for work, already dreading what I'd come home to. Leaving for work that morning, I tried to push the tension from the previous night out of my mind. I focused on the tasks ahead, hoping the day would provide some relief from the chaos at home. By the time I returned that evening, I was mentally exhausted and eager for a quiet dinner. But as I approached the house, the thumping bass of loud music greeted me before I even reached the door. My heart sank. This couldn't be real. Surely, I thought, I'd walked into someone else's nightmare. But no, it was my house. My sanctuary. And it was hosting a party I hadn't approved. Opening the door, I was met with a scene that could only be described as madness. Strangers were everywhere, spilling drinks, laughing loudly, and dancing without a care in the world. Some of my friends were there too, looking out of place and uncomfortable. One of them approached me as soon as I stepped inside. "Hey, man," he said, his voice low. "I don't know whose idea this was, but it's not what I expected. There's some guy walking around pitching open marriage to people. It's weird." My blood boiled. "Where's my wife?" I asked, my voice clipped. He shrugged. "Haven't seen her in a while. Honestly, we were about to leave. This whole thing feels off." That was all I needed to hear. I pushed through the crowd, scanning faces and dodging spilled drinks, trying to find her. Strangers stared at me, but I ignored them, focused on my mission. After searching the downstairs rooms and finding no sign of her, I headed upstairs, dreading what I might find. My heart pounded as I checked each room. Finally, in the bedroom, I found her. She was sprawled across the bed, deeply asleep and clearly drunk. The sight made my stomach churn. This was my wife, the woman I'd vowed to build a life with, and here she was, passed out in the middle of a disaster she had likely facilitated. I stormed back downstairs and called for everyone's attention. "Party's over," I announced. "Get out. Now." Some people laughed, thinking I was joking, but I wasn't in the mood to argue. I said, "Get out." I bellowed. My friends backed me up, helping to usher the guests out the door. Bottles clinked as they were knocked over, and chairs scraped against the floor as people scrambled to leave. Within minutes, the house was empty, except for the couple who had started all of this. The husband of the pair had the audacity to approach me. "Look," he began, "we didn't mean for things to get out of hand. We're really sorry, but we've got nowhere else to go. Our landlord kicked us out, and we thought we could stay here for a bit while we figure things out." I stared at him, barely containing my anger. "That's not my problem. You've overstayed your welcome, and you've crossed every possible line. Get out. Now." They tried to argue, but I wasn't listening. My patience had run out. I said, "Out." Defeated, they finally gathered their things and left, muttering apologies that meant nothing to me. Once the door closed behind them, I let out a long breath and looked around at the wreckage. The house was a mess, empty bottles and food wrappers everywhere, sticky floors, and a couch that smelled like spilled beer. I grabbed a trash bag and started cleaning up, too wound up to sit still. As I worked, my mind raced. How had it come to this? How had my home, my life, been turned upside down in such a short amount of time? I couldn't avoid the inevitable confrontation with my wife. She would have to answer for this, for the chaos, for the strangers, for the couple who had so shamelessly imposed on us. And most of all, for keeping me in the dark about everything. Who were these people? What was their story? And why had she let them into our lives without telling me the truth? As I tossed another broken bottle into the trash bag, I knew one thing for certain: we were going to have a serious conversation, and it wouldn't be a pleasant one. I woke up feeling worse than I had the night before. The stress, the lack of sleep, and the disaster of the past few days had finally caught up to me. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. I called in sick and decided to take the day to regroup. As I shuffled out of bed, I realized the house was eerily quiet. My wife was nowhere to be found. Her side of the bed was cold, and there was no sign of her in the kitchen or living room. Immediately, suspicion flared. It didn't take much to guess where she might be. I grabbed my phone and called her. It rang a few times before she answered, her voice annoyingly casual. "Hey, I'm at my friend's place. Don't worry, everything's fine. I'll be back soon." Her tone, light and dismissive, only fueled my irritation. "What do you mean, you're at a friend's?" I snapped. "Where exactly have you been all morning? Why didn't you tell me?" She sighed, as if I were the unreasonable one. "Calm down. I'll explain when I get home." And with that, she hung up. My fists clenched around the phone. The audacity of her nonchalance made my blood boil. When she finally arrived, I was ready. I'd spent the morning cleaning up the aftermath of the previous night's disaster, taking photos of the wreckage as proof of how far things had spiraled out of control. I showed her the pictures one by one, laying them out like evidence in a courtroom. "This is what I came home to," I said, my voice ice cold. I expected to find some semblance of normalcy, maybe even a quiet evening. Instead, I walked into chaos. "And where were you?" "Drunk and passed out upstairs. I had to kick out those freeloaders myself." She crossed her arms and frowned. "I noticed. And honestly, that was really mean of you. They needed help, and you threw them out like they were trash. It wasn't fair." Her words struck a nerve. "Not fair?" I repeated, incredulous. "What's not fair is you inviting strangers into our home without my consent. What's not fair is you keeping me in the dark about all of this. And what's definitely not fair is you expecting me to clean up the mess they left behind while you go play savior." She rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed with my argument. "Fine. You want to know where I was? I was helping them find a new place to stay. And, for your information, they're going to live with my friend now. So there. Problem solved." Her smug tone only irritated me further. "Problem solved?" I asked, incredulous. "You just dumped your problem onto someone else. You've essentially handed your friend a ticking time bomb. Do you even know what kind of trouble you've gotten us into?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Look, you don't understand. I've been talking to them for weeks. They're good people. They just hit a rough patch. I met them on a forum about personal freedom and success. They're working on this amazing course that's going to help so many people. I took their course, and it changed my perspective on life. They said I was great, and we became friends. But they had some issues with their studio, and they needed somewhere to stay while they worked on a new program. That's all this is." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You took some online course, befriended the instructors, and decided it was a good idea to let them live with us. Without asking me?" She didn't flinch. "Yes. And honestly, I think you're being dramatic about this whole thing. They even offered us a chance to invest in their next course. The returns could be huge." My patience snapped. "Invest? Absolutely not. We're not giving them a single cent. They've done nothing but disrupt our lives since they got here. And another thing," I said, pointing a finger at her, "you're done talking to them. I don't care what they promised or how much you believe in their bullshit. You're cutting ties with them. End of discussion." She glared at me, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "You can't just tell me who I can and can't talk to," she said, her voice shaking with defiance. "Watch me," I replied, turning my back on her. The rest of the day passed in icy silence, with her sulking in one corner of the house and me cleaning up the remains of yet another disaster. But no matter how quiet the house became, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 3 weeks had gone by since the whirlwind of chaos had seemingly subsided. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, and I began to feel like the storm might truly be over. The house was quiet, the nights were undisturbed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could come home and not brace myself for whatever might await me. I found solace in routine, hoping that my wife had finally taken to heart everything we'd argued about. But, as they say, peace is often the prelude to a new storm. One evening, I returned home after a long day at work, ready to enjoy a calm evening. As I walked through the door, I could hear my wife talking on the phone. It wasn't unusual, but something about the tone of her voice caught my attention. She sounded animated, excited even. I called out a quick greeting, which she acknowledged distractedly, then made my way to the bathroom to wash up. As I stood there, scrubbing the grime of the day from my hands, I realized she was still on the phone. The conversation was dragging on longer than usual. A nagging thought crept into my mind. Could it be them again? The couple who had wreaked havoc on our lives not so long ago? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the idea. Surely she wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Surely she had learned her lesson. But as the minutes ticked by and the conversation showed no signs of ending, my unease grew. I finished washing up and headed back to the living room, determined to get some answers. Just as I entered the room, she hung up the phone. Her eye sparkled with an intensity one hadn't seen in weeks. Before I could say a word, she turned to me with a wide grin and said, "You won't believe this. I've had so much time to think over the past few weeks, and I've realized something. The reason I've been feeling so stuck lately, like I'm in a rut, is because I haven't been working." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this was going. "Of course," I said. "That's what I've been saying. Things would be a lot easier if you had a job. It's good for structure, purpose, and, well, the finances." She nodded eagerly, as if she had come to this revelation all on her own. "Exactly. And guess what? My friend just offered me a job. She's coming over tomorrow to explain everything." This caught me off guard. "A job?" I asked, cautiously optimistic. "What kind of job?" She shrugged, clearly unbothered by the lack of specifics. She didn't go into a lot of detail, but it's remote, and the hours are super flexible. Sometimes I'd have to go to the office, but only to submit reports or meet deadlines. It's perfect, don't you think? I wanted to feel relieved, but the vagueness of it all set off alarm bells in my head. Still, I decided not to jump to conclusions. "I guess that depends on what it actually entails," I said. "When she comes over tomorrow, we'll hear her out and see what she has to say." My wife's enthusiasm didn't waver. "It's going to be great," she insisted. "I'm finally going to have something meaningful to do. And you'll see, this is going to be a game changer for both of us." I gave her a tight-lipped smile, still feeling skeptical but unwilling to burst her bubble just yet. "All right," I said, nodding slowly. "Okay, let's see what your friend has to say tomorrow. Go ahead and invite her over. We'll take it from there." Despite my reservations, I knew there was no point in arguing about something that hadn't even been fully explained yet. For now, I'd play along, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was letting on. That day was one of my rare days off, and I decided to make the most of it. My wife and I spent the morning tidying up the house and preparing for her friend's visit. She was clearly excited, going out of her way to make everything perfect. I, on the other hand, approached the situation with cautious optimism. While I was glad she was finally considering work, I couldn't ignore the nagging doubts in the back of my mind. By early afternoon, the house was spotless, the table was set, and we were ready for her friend's arrival. The doorbell rang right on time. I opened the door, and there she was, the same woman who had housed that troublesome couple weeks ago. My stomach tightened instinctively, but I kept my face neutral. She greeted us warmly and stepped inside, looking far more composed than during our last encounter. My wife, practically beaming, ushered her into the living room, and we all sat down to chat. The initial conversation was polite and light, mostly small talk. I waited patiently, eager to get to the real reason for her visit. At one point, I couldn't help but bring up the elephant in the room. "So, about that couple who was staying with you," I began, careful to keep my tone casual. "How's that situation going?" She didn't hesitate. "Oh, I kicked them out weeks ago," she said firmly. "They were not what I expected. Don't worry, they're not my problem anymore." Her answer was straightforward and logical enough to put me at ease. If nothing else, it seemed like she had learned her lesson about letting them overstay their welcome. With that out of the way, she shifted the conversation to the real purpose of her visit, explaining the job she had offered my wife. She laid out the responsibilities in detail, describing how my wife would be working remotely to process applications in their system. Occasionally, she would need to visit the office to submit reports and handle payroll tasks, but most of the work could be done from the comfort of home. The pay structure sounded fair, with a base salary plus a percentage of sales. As far as I could tell, it seemed legitimate. I glanced at my wife, who was hanging on every word. She looked thrilled, and I could see the enthusiasm in her eyes. "That sounds great," I said cautiously. "And everything's above board?" Her friend smiled reassuringly. "Of course. We've been running this for years. It's a great opportunity, and I think she'll be fantastic at it." My wife nodded eagerly, clearly ready to dive in. I decided not to press further. "All right then. Sounds like you've got yourself a deal," I said. From that day forward, my wife's work began. She threw herself into it with surprising enthusiasm, setting up her workspace and diving into the tasks assigned to her. For the first time in a while, she seemed genuinely energized and purposeful. I watched from the sidelines, silently relieved to see her so engaged. The house felt different, too, calmer, more focused. It was a welcome change. About a week into her new job, she approached me with another bit of news. "They're having a little office party next week," she said, her tone light and cheerful. "It's just a small gathering to celebrate some milestones. I'll need to go into the office for it." I nodded, seeing no harm in it. "All right. Sounds reasonable. I might be late getting home that day, though, so don't wait up for me." She smiled, clearly unfazed by my potential absence. "That's fine," she said. "Actually, they're planning something special for me at the party. A little surprise. So don't worry if I'm out late, okay? Everything's going to be great." Her excitement was infectious, but a small part of me couldn't help but wonder what kind of surprise they had in store. Still, I nodded and said, "All right. Have fun, and let me know how it goes." She kissed me on the cheek and walked away, humming to herself, leaving me to hope that this new chapter in her life would finally bring some stability to ours. The day began like any other. I was at work, focused on the usual tasks, when I received a notification on my phone that made my stomach drop. Nearly all the money in my bank account had been withdrawn. I stared at the screen in disbelief, refreshing the app repeatedly in the hope that it was some sort of glitch. But the numbers didn't change. Panic quickly set in. What the hell was going on? I excused myself from a meeting, called my bank, and they confirmed that the transactions had gone through. It wasn't a mistake. I immediately informed my boss that I needed to leave. Fortunately, he's an understanding guy and didn't ask too many questions. I jumped in my car and drove home as fast as I legally could, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it fraud? Had my account been hacked? Or was it something worse? By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was on edge, prepared for the worst but still hoping for some rational explanation. As soon as I opened the door, my worst fears were realized. There, in our bedroom, was my wife. And she wasn't alone. That man from the infamous couple was with her, both of them caught in the act. My world seemed to tilt as rage surged through me. I pulled out my phone and started recording, not trusting myself to speak without evidence of what I was seeing. My wife screamed at me to stop, but I didn't. I needed proof. Proof for what, I didn't yet know, but I knew I needed it. I put the phone down and reached into the drawer of the bedside table, where I kept my firearm for emergencies. The situation was escalating quickly, but my actions felt oddly deliberate, almost automatic. I pointed the gun at the man, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" I demanded. He stammered, his hands up in a show of surrender, while my wife tried to intervene. "Put it down," she begged. "You don't understand." But before anyone could calm the situation, the man made a sudden move toward me. My reflexes took over, and I fired. The bullet hit him in the stomach, and he collapsed onto the floor, groaning in pain. The sound of the shot rang through the house, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. My wife screamed, her hands covering her mouth, as I reached for my phone to call the police. Within minutes, officers and paramedics arrived, and the man was rushed to the hospital under police supervision. They took my statement, confiscated my firearm, and assured me the situation would be thoroughly investigated. When the chaos settled and we were alone, I turned to my wife, my anger boiling over. What the hell were you thinking? I shouted. She tried to compose herself, but her voice trembled as she spoke. Before you judge me, just listen, she said. I want to be honest with you. I've been unfaithful. Not just with him, but with others. 6 others, to be exact. And I realize that I can't stop. It's something I enjoy, something I need. That's why I'm proposing we open our marriage. I stared at her, stunned. My mind couldn't process the words coming out of her mouth. Open our marriage? After everything she had done? Get out, I said coldly. She blinked, clearly surprised by my lack of reaction. Take your things and get out of my house. Now. To my shock, she didn't argue. She calmly packed a bag, walked out the door, and left without so much as a backward glance. Once she was gone, I locked every door and window in the house, ensuring no one could disturb the fragile solitude I had reclaimed. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, but I knew one thing: I needed a break from all of this. I called my boss and explained the situation, requesting some time off. He agreed without hesitation, offering his support and understanding. Next, I called the bank to block my account and prevent any further unauthorized transactions. The representative assured me they'd investigate the withdrawals, but it would take time. As I hung up the phone, the weight of the day finally crashed down on me. Exhausted and emotionally drained, I fell onto the couch and closed my eyes. For now, there was nothing more I could do. Tomorrow, I would pick up the pieces and figure out how to move forward. But tonight, all I could do was try to get some rest. The next morning, I woke up feeling slightly more composed, though the events of the previous day still weighed heavily on me. My house was quiet, eerily so, but for once, I welcomed the silence. As I moved around, trying to put my thoughts in order, my eyes landed on her laptop. She had left it on the dining table, a glaring reminder of her presence despite her absence. Curiosity, or perhaps desperation, got the better of me. I sat down, opened the lid, and watched the screen come to life. I had no idea what I was about to uncover. The desktop was cluttered with folders and icons, but one stood out immediately: the program she had been using for her so-called job. I clicked on it, and within seconds, the truth began to unravel. It was the course she had mentioned, the one created by that insufferable couple. The realization hit me like a freight train. My hands shook as I navigated through the files, each click revealing more evidence of deceit. This wasn't just a harmless job, it was a well-organized scam, and my wife had been deeply involved. As I delved deeper, I found a folder filled with chat logs and emails. Reading through them, I pieced together the full extent of the betrayal. The couple hadn't been kicked out by her friend as I had been led to believe. On the contrary, her friend had been a willing participant in their schemes. Together, they had formed a group to orchestrate this scam, recruiting others and building a network of deception. My wife's role? Processing applications and, worse, accessing people's financial information. The very thought made my stomach churn. One email thread caught my attention. It was a conversation between my wife, the couple, and her friend. They discussed their plans openly, even brazenly. The tone was celebratory, as if they were proud of their deceit. They joked about how easily people fell for their pitches and how lucrative the operation had become. And then I saw it, a message about me. They had planned for her to leave me eventually, but not before she drained as much money as she could from me. My jaw tightened as I read their cold, calculated words. The audacity was staggering. The pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The unexplained withdrawals from my account, the secrecy, and her sudden interest in this so-called job, it all made sense now. Further digging revealed client information, including bank details that had been used for fraudulent charges. My wife had memorized my account details, using our trusted devices to authorize transactions without raising suspicion. It was a scheme so audacious that I almost couldn't believe it was real. What angered me most was the sheer arrogance of it all. They had left a digital trail, as if they were untouchable. Chat logs, spreadsheets, even screenshots of their victims' account information were neatly stored on her laptop. It was as if they hadn't considered the possibility of being caught. Her carelessness became their undoing. She had been so preoccupied with her newfound life of deceit and infidelity that she hadn't even bothered to clean up after herself. Every file, every message, was there, waiting to be discovered. As I closed the laptop, my anger turned to resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. They had hurt countless others, and it was time for them to face the consequences. I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Thankfully, he picked up on the first ring. I explained everything as succinctly as I could, detailing the scam, the financial theft, and the evidence I had found. He listened intently, his tone growing more serious with every word. "We need to meet," he said firmly. "Bring everything you have." I agreed and set a time for later that day. As I hung up the phone, I glanced back at the laptop, its screen dark now, but still a glaring reminder of everything that had been lost. My marriage, my trust, my financial security, all of it had been shattered by the very person who should have protected it. But as devastating as it was, I knew one thing: this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a fight to take back what was mine and to ensure they never did this to anyone else again. Once all the evidence had been gathered, the pieces fell into place with startling clarity. My attorney and I worked tirelessly to build a solid case against the scam operation. The evidence from the laptop, combined with financial records and witness statements, painted a damning picture of their activities. We presented everything to the authorities, and it didn't take long for them to act. The wheels of justice turned quickly, fueled by the overwhelming amount of proof we had. One of the key players, the man from the couple, was still in the hospital recovering from his injury. The police wasted no time interrogating him once we filed charges. Cornered and unable to deny the mountain of evidence against him, he cracked under pressure. During his confession, he laid out their entire operation, implicating my wife, her friend, and the rest of the group. His statements aligned perfectly with the information we had uncovered, solidifying the case even further. Their plan had been simple yet bold: wait for the man to recover, then disappear before anyone could catch them. They had underestimated me, assuming I'd stay silent or move on. Instead, my determination to hold them accountable caught them off guard. Their overconfidence proved to be their undoing, and within days, warrants were issued for everyone involved. Police apprehended the remaining members of the group, including my wife's so-called friend, who had been instrumental in coordinating their scams. The fallout was swift and severe. My wife, now under arrest, was granted one phone call. Of all people, she chose to call me. When I picked up, I was met with an angry tirade. She screamed about how terrible I was for betraying her, for not letting her go, and ruining her life. The irony was almost too much to bear. Here was the woman who had cheated on me, stolen my money, and participated in a scam that hurt countless others, now playing the victim. I didn't let her finish. I hung up, her curses still ringing in my ears. It was a small, petty victory, but one I didn't regret. With her in custody, I turned my focus to the next step: divorce. My attorney guided me through the process, and with the evidence we had, it was a relatively straightforward case. The court had no trouble granting me the upper hand. The recordings, the financial proof, and the blatant betrayal all worked in my favor. Because my wife had never held a steady job and most of our assets had been acquired before the marriage, I retained ownership of the house, the car, and the majority of our finances. The divorce was finalized quickly, leaving me free to rebuild my life. My ex-wife's situation, however, was far less fortunate. As the trial for the scam unfolded, it became clear that while she and her friend were deeply involved, their lawyers managed to secure lighter sentences for them. They argued that my wife and her friend were not fully aware of the scale of the scam, painting them as gullible participants rather than masterminds. The judge granted them conditional sentences and ankle monitors, ensuring they couldn't leave their homes without permission. It was frustrating to see them evade harsher punishment, but at least they were marked by their actions. The couple, however, wasn't so lucky. Their role as the orchestrators of the operation left no room for leniency. The evidence, combined with their hospital confession, sealed their fate. They were sentenced to significant prison time, ensuring they wouldn't have the chance to exploit anyone else for years to come. Watching them face justice was a moment of vindication, a small measure of closure after months of chaos. As the courtroom drama ended, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. It felt like the end of a long, grueling chapter. Yet, even as I walked away from the courthouse, a nagging feeling lingered. Something about the way my ex-wife had calmly accepted her ankle monitor, about the way her friend avoided eye contact during sentencing, unsettled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. They had escaped full accountability, and I suspected they wouldn't stay idle for long. The couple's imprisonment brought some relief, but it also left me wary. I knew how cunning they had been to build their operation in the first place, and I couldn't help but wonder what else they might have set in motion. As much as I wanted to move on, the shadow of their actions still loomed over me. And so, while one chapter had closed, another seemed poised to begin. Some time had passed, and my life had finally begun to settle into a new rhythm. I had moved on, found a wonderful new girlfriend, and taken the necessary steps to rebuild my sense of security. One of the first things I did was change the locks on my house, ensuring that any remnants of my old life couldn't slip back in uninvited. Things were good, stable even, and I dared to think that chapter of chaos was firmly behind me. Then, one evening, there was an unexpected knock at the door. I opened it to find my ex-wife standing there, no longer wearing the ankle monitor that had kept her tethered for months. She wasted no time launching into demands, claiming that since the house was once ours, she had every right to move back in. I didn't let her get far. "Get lost," I said firmly. "I've proven in court that this house is mine. Besides, I've moved on. I've got someone new, so why don't you find your way back to your lover in prison?" My words hit their mark. Her face twisted in fury as I calmly shut the door in her face. For several minutes, she pounded on the door, shouting obscenities and threats. My girlfriend, understandably shaken, stood by my side, uncertain of what might happen next. I reassured her, staying close until the commotion subsided. Eventually, my ex-wife's persistence wore out, and she stormed off into the night. The sound of her retreating footsteps was a relief, though the tension lingered in the air. From that day forward, my ex-wife didn't return. It was as if she finally understood that she no longer had any power over me or my life. My girlfriend and I continued to build our future together, leaving the shadows of the past firmly behind us. The peace that followed was something I cherished deeply, a reminder that no matter how turbulent life becomes, it is possible to move forward and find happiness again.